Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone, your host for the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series, which is a production of Harvard University's Center for Atlantic Studies. Our guest today, whom we are very happy to welcome here, is Suzanne Lye, who is Assistant Professor of Classics at UNC, University of North Carolina. She has her bachelor's degree from Harvard, where, however, her field of concentration was organic chemistry.
It's actually history and science.
Oh, where did I find that? I was misinformed. She earned her classics PhD, however, from UCLA, and after that was a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth. Suzanne has described herself to me as an underworld scholar, which I love the sound of. And her topic today is magical strategies for everyday problems. Now, before I let you begin, I must make you pass through the same ritual as all who venture here, which is to answer the question, what was your earliest influential encounter with the classical world? What brought you to love it?
Yeah, my journey into classics was long, and it wasn't linear in any way. I was going to say torturous, but so it was only torturous sometimes, though. But I think my earliest encounter with the classical world was Catholic school, like going to Catholic school, and I took Latin in high school, but I never thought about pursuing it. So when you said my concentration was organic chemistry, that was the focus. So I did a degree that was history and science, which was organic chemistry was my focus. So I still actually think of myself as a scientist. So when I graduated, I was planning on being a chemist. And then I took some time off, did a few different things. And then what really sparked my love of ancient Greek language and culture was I went to Akrotiri, which is a archaeological site on Thera, which is Santorini. And then after that, I took Greek for the first time at Harvard. I was there just for a couple years, and I took Greek, and I'm like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And I want to study mythology for the rest of my life. And so really, I'm an underworld scholar, but I like to tell my students I'm a mythologist, and I will talk mythology all day long.
Wonderful. Well, we only need you for an hour in this case. So please take it away.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for coming. So part of the reason I wanted to do this was I wanted to talk to you guys about a part of the ancient world which I think is so incredibly fascinating, but also not fully established as something that the general public knows about, which is, we know about some ancient religion and things like that, but not as much about ancient magic, which overlaps quite a bit with ancient religion. And so that's part of the problem. So a lot of the things that we'll be discussing today are objects and inscriptions and spells that scholars have known about for a long time, but they have not been able to classify them very easily, mostly because they are everyday things, everyday objects that have been infused with meaning that are personal meaning, and sometimes they're in junk heaps, sometimes they're in graves, and they don't seem related to the other things that they're found around. But more recently, scholars have started to collect these things together and start to see patterns of practice and belief and language. So I have a little bit of a slide presentation, and then as you see on the site, I've given you a bunch of case studies that we can discuss as well, because it's really when you delve into the case studies that you get a sense almost of contact with ancient people, and what their concerns were on the everyday, not just what they thought about philosophically or historically or in a literary way, but just the things that they were worried about, just like we worry about going through our day. So if you don't mind, if we could go to the slide show. Okay, so I will run through this, and mostly I'm doing this because there's so many great images, and the images I have here on this opening slide are just some of the examples. So you see, when I talk about magical strategies, I'm talking about things that occur in what would normally be called religion, as well as what would be called magic. And so those terms, religion and magic, are kind of fluid, and I will just say, so religion, the way I've seen it defined in dictionaries, it literally means to bind, right? And usually it has something to do with the supernatural. It's a set of practices, and it's really steeped in stories and myth as well as ritual. And you do those things as a group, and usually for an encounter with the supernatural. On the flip side, there's magic, which is similarly informed by myth and ritual, but there's a slightly different tone to magic, which is that it has you are taking, as the practitioner, the power to influence events using the supernatural. So there's more of a sense of agency in magic, like individual agency. Whereas with religion, often you have to make a prayer, make a request, and then you kind of have to wait around. It's not as direct. But with a lot of the magical items that we're looking at, they want results, and they want them sooner rather than later. Okay, but so there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of magic is trial and error. And some of my students ask me, did it work? And I say, I don't know if it worked, but people believed in it. They believed that it worked, and maybe they practiced something, like they tried to get somebody to fall in love with them, and then it happened, and then the magician or the practitioner said, okay, that spell worked, I'm going to use it again. So there was a very much almost a scientific method with magic that seems a little bit different to what what we know about with religion. So magic seemed more scientific in many ways from the modern perspective. All right, can I have the next slide, please? All right, so what informed ancient Greek religious practice? So geography and the Greek city-state. So a lot of ancient religion is place-based. And a lot of the institutions of religion are woven into political institutions. And so it created a certain setting for the practice of religion and magic and how people viewed their world. And they really saw their everything as being interconnected, and events that happen in the past affecting events that are happening now or in the future. And so there were solutions to in causing events to go in a certain direction or not. And that solution often was doing something to appease gods in some way. But geography and the city-state was really important in the early development of Greek religion. Can I go to the next slide, please? And so when you look, though, at Roman religious practice, they had slightly different stressors that helped develop their practices that made them slightly different from Greek practices, although they did adopt a lot of the Greek practices. And geography, again, was a factor, but also the fact that in Rome, with their very expansive empire, they came in contact with a lot of different peoples and a lot of different gods. And so they had to somehow integrate those, or they would have constant rebellion, probably. So they found ways to coexist, or have different peoples with different beliefs coexist. And they did it in really interesting ways. And it's that mix that helped create a lot of the combinations that we'll see in the spells, where an Olympian god might be mentioned, but also a Jewish god or an Egyptian god side by side. And there's something taboo about that juxtaposition. Okay, next slide, please. And so what's really important to know, like when you're thinking about the practitioners or who's using the magic, or the religion, and who is doing the magic and religion, what did the Greeks and Romans look like? Who were they? And I love these Fayum mummy portraits because it just shows you the variety. So these are all people from Egypt. So these mummy portraits are from Rome and Egypt. And these are actual portraits that survived in the desert, in the Fayum. And so you can see the variety of what people look like who would identify themselves as Romans. These are mostly wealthy because they could afford mummies and mummy portraits, and they probably were Greek speaking as well. So you have these multicultural people, multilingual, with many influences in this place that was a place where a lot of people went through with different beliefs and different objects. And in the sources, it seems, especially the literary ones that we have, the best magic seemed to be associated with Egypt and what's called the East. And Egypt was considered part of the East as well. So more Asia Minor and beyond. So outside of, like modern day Greece and Rome, although there were plenty of things there as well. Okay, next slide, please. And so some of the underlying concepts I just wanted to share with you, and of course I'm condensing a lot of information into very few slides, but some underlying concepts that seem to thread throughout both the religious and magical material that we're going to look at is polytheism. So there's supernatural forces all around. And for the Greeks, they call them daimons, right? You probably know that word. And there are daimons and there are theoi, and they're both supernatural classes of beings. And for the Romans, they had, the dei, the gods, but they also had numen. They had numen, plural numina, which are these spirits of things, spirits in animate things. And so if you walk through a world where every living thing has some sort of sentience in some way, then you realize you have to relate to the world in a different way. Everything is interconnected, and much of both the religious and magical material we look at has this concept of do ut des, I give so that you give. So I'm going to do this sacrifice, I'm going to do this ritual, but I expect a return on this, either immediately, as with a lot of the magical spells we look at, but maybe even long-term, like prosperity for the upcoming year. Okay. And two of the main ideas with the study of ancient religion that come up are orthopraxy versus orthodoxy. So orthopraxy means right practice, meaning going through the actual motions of things as being privileged in the ancient world, versus orthodoxy, which a lot of the monotheistic religions put more stock in, that like right belief. It doesn't, you could actually believe in God and maybe not go to church. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, that was less of a possibility to do, especially because religion was so integrated into state and civic institutions. And so you had to show up for the festival and the theater and the state sacrifices. You could not just say, I don't believe in it, I check out, right? So you had to show up. So those are very important basic ideas, orthopraxy versus orthodoxy. And so even though the ancient Greeks and Romans were orthopraxic from what it seems like from the outside, that doesn't mean they didn't have personal beliefs in what they were doing. And that they didn't have personal beliefs in some sort of supernatural world. I think in modern day, we might say spiritual, but for the ancients, that spiritual actually was associated with spirits, with daimones, and numina. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so what does Greek religion look like? It looks a lot like this. So there's a lot of architecture. So sites where you go for festivals, for oracles, and they have stories of the gods on them. So as I said, myths, that temple frieze shows a myth on there. And the vase shows a sacrifice scene. So sacrifice was an essential part of Greek religion. And these are very recognizable to people who studied the ancient world. But I want to also say for Greek magic or Roman magic, they also have these same features of the importance of place, sacrifice, and also stories about the effectiveness of what's going on and what the procedures are. Okay, next slide. And so Roman religion looks similarly in that there's place, right? And there are gods. You see these statues of gods. And so one of the features you see in Roman religion, you see a lot of foreign cults as well in the iconography. So I have two here, Roman Isis and Magna Mater, which were not originally Roman, but became very Roman in that a lot of people practice them. And on the far right, you see the haruspics looking into entrails, and that was adopted by the Romans from the Etruscans. So haruspics is an Etruscan priest that became part of the Roman state apparatus. So Romans and Greeks, they wouldn't do any major state events until they'd done a sacrifice and checked in with the gods. So that's something also kind of different. I think in America, a lot of people will say the Pledge of Allegiance or say the national anthem before a special event, but the Romans took that to a different degree. You could not start state business unless the readings came in correctly. So that's kind of different. Okay, next slide. And so the official forms of religious practice, as I mentioned before, were festivals, sacrifices, music, and games. And we can see some of this on the vase paintings. These are all vase painting pictures. The agonistic context, I think some of you guys know or read about that, of the ancient Greeks in particular. So all the festivals had competitions, musical, athletic, as well as sacrifice. So they had all these elements in different combinations. And so people would go, and it was a big social event. It's like Carnival, right? It's like, and Mardi Gras, the big party, where everybody gets together and worships together and reinforces community bonds, which is one of the very important features of religious practice. Okay, next slide, please. And then on the flip side, so even while people were doing those public forms of practice, there were also personal forms of religious and magical practice, and mystery and ecstatic cults kind of fall in between. They're still part of ancient religion, but a lot of the practices were seen as being sometimes in opposition to civic religion, but people might actually believe in them, which it's hard to track. But anyway, so there were mystery cults to Dionysus. There are these Orphic gold tablets, which indicate a mystery cult to Orpheus. There were the Pythagoreans, and there was the cult, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was the most popular, longest living cult. Mystery cult, and for all these mystery cults, you had to be initiated. So you couldn't it wasn't like state cult where you could just show up and you had to go through the motions. With these mystery cults, you had to actually go through certain procedures to be a member. And then you might have an identifying feature, like that ring, that signet ring that for Christian cult, that's a symbol of Christ, and it's on a ring. So somebody might have worn that. So it may not be obvious to everybody that this person was a Christian, but for those in the know, they would see that, and you might give a little nod to somebody because you recognize them. It's like when people wear pendants that are a cross around their neck. It sort of self-identifies, and so as people are moving through their world, they are identifying themselves as members of different denominations or cults, magical cults that are operating alongside of the state cults. Okay, next slide. And alongside that, they're also, in the Roman context, we know more, but they're also personal and family rituals. And so there are gods that the Romans have, family gods, the Lares and the Penates, which the Greeks do not have. And so the Romans, even as they took on other gods from other places, they never gave up these household gods. And so this lar, it looks really big in this picture. It's maybe the size probably of your hand. It's really tiny and it's portable. And it would reside in the house in a little shrine in the corner of the house. And you can see what one of those look like on the slide as well. And so maybe at a certain time of day, people would go there and potentially light a candle, give some oil, bathe the god. That's something that's even practiced in some modern religions as well. They would give the god its due, the household god. So next slide, please. And often they would show these images of the personal household gods in wall painting. So this is a wall painting as well. And it has some, as you see, the similar figures, the Lares and Penates up top, and the snake is the genius of the family, meaning the the identity of the family that travels through members of that family. And so the Romans were ancestor worshipers. So they really put a lot of stock in rituals around their family and around ancestors. And that was considered religion. But it does have some elements, like especially the use of images and oils and things like that, and bathing the gods and things like that, and having a special place for it that is also part of magic, I guess. And partly what you do this talk is about magical strategies for everyday problems. You could appeal to your ancestors to help you with prosperity in your family and things that are happening in the lives of your family as well. And there's this sense that they're always looking over you and helping you out. Okay, next slide, please. And when we look at magic, so mostly what I was looking at before is things that were by scholars very early identified as religious things, things associated with official religion. And when we look at more of the magical things, the things that are classified as magic, we start to see some things that for us kind of go off the deep end, but for the ancients was just part of, just part of the things that were available to them to deal with an uncertain world. And I had you read a bunch of underworld scenes, right? So there were necromantic scenes. So that's the Elpenor vase on the top. And so you read Odyssey 11. This is a slightly different version, it seems, of that story because Hermes is on this vase. And in Odyssey 11, you do not see Hermes, right? So you see Elpenor coming out of the ground, and you see Odysseus sitting on the rock after having done a blood ritual, right? So this is almost a shamanistic procedure. He marks off the land, he makes the sacrifices, and he waits, and then the spirits start to come to him. On the right, you see a cursed tablet, and cursed tablets are also called defixio in Latin and katadesmos in Greek. And cursed tablets are generally binding tablets, meaning they hold somebody or restrain somebody to do something or to prevent them from doing something. And so they come on different material. This one is on it's lead. It's on a lead tablet, and those are the most common because lead is very soft, so you can carve into it, and you can also fold it, bend it, roll it, and it's light, so you can carry it with you. And then on the bottom, this is interesting, and I gave you this from Betts as well, and so often they put figures like these, and they would put writing, and sometimes it would be a human figure, and sometimes it would be something that looked an animal or something that's supposed to be a god, and they would put writing on the parts that they hoped would be affected by the spell. And usually you'd have procedures done. And as you can see from this image, this image was on a papyrus that they found. Okay, next slide, please. And so the main goal of magic was to compel the supernatural in sacrifice, prayers, also spells, and for various protections. And so these are all examples that we're seeing here of, so you see the sacrifice of the pig, then you have a sacrifice on the right of a bull, and then the bottom two are protective amulets. So on the left, you have, it's a pendant, and you have some writing in Greek on one side, and on the other, it shows Lazarus rising from the grave. And so this is a Christian amulet that somebody would have worn. And on the right is the fascinum, which is, there are like so many of these. And so this is one of the most, let's see, elaborate ones that they have, but it's the flying penis, which is, it wards off evil spirits. So this is what, and I mean, you've seen the cave paintings in France and things like that. They have pictures of penises on them as well. In Greek, we call them phalluses, and a lot of them are not necessarily sexual. They're dominant territory defining. So almost typical primate procedure, an erect phallus to ward off evil spirits. Okay, next slide. And so I have a couple of case studies here for you as well. So I'm going to read this one. And if you have any questions, you can jump in because I know I've been speaking for a lot now. So this one is, I turn Eubula away from Aeneas, from his face, from his eyes, from his mouth, from his chest, from his soul, from his belly, from his erect penis, from his anus, from all his body. I turn Eubula away from Aeneas. So I'd like to stop for a moment in just the presentation and part of this and see does anybody have any questions or notice anything about this?
What kind of context is this? Is Eubulus a malignant spirit, or is this an interpersonal charm of some kind? Do we know?
Well, let me just look at it really quickly. So yeah, so Eubulus. So usually in a tablet, so this is an erotic curse. So Eubula is a woman.
Eubula.
She's a woman, right? And so the person who is the I, the person who is speaking, maybe somebody who loves Eubula, maybe somebody who hates Aeneas, maybe, but basically it's trying to compel Eubula's behavior. It could also be, and this is interesting, it could be Eubula's parents who are trying to prevent her from getting into a bad match, a bad love match, because they want to marry her off to somebody. So it's really hard to tell who, like we have this inscription. It's easy to read, and it's on this tablet, right? And so I put this information that it was folded and then a nail was put through it. So it could, like the fine spot, I don't know the fine spot for it, but often these lead tablets, cursed tablets in particular, were found, they were buried near thresholds. They were nailed to the wall of a place. Sometimes they were brought to a temple. The strongest magic ones, the ones that appealed to gods, they would find a freshly buried great person, like a grave, and they would put a tablet like this in that spot, like dig up a little hole and put the tablet in there and sort of get the supernatural to help them with their cause. And one thing I'd like to point out as well, do you notice the formulaic nature of this language? So it's very rhythmic, chant-like, right? And so that's also, there was power in that. That's what I was talking about earlier about the linguistic features in the formula that are used. They've even found a spell that had blanks. So that, these were probably mass-produced. They're pretty sure they were mass-produced because there's so many with the same language. And so you could actually go to a practitioner. They might have a little shop. Maybe they sold other things, but they have a little corner. And you could go and purchase a curse tablet or an erotic tablet or something like that. And you could, the practitioner could fill it out for you, fill out the names. Or maybe you could even take it home and do it yourself and just have it ready to go whenever you might need it. Okay, so let's move to the next one, next slide, which is another erotic curse. Okay, so this one, I bind the head of Diodorus to be turned away from Artemidora, his forehead, his eyes, his ears, his mouth, his chin, his arms. I bind the soul of Diodorus to be turned away from Artemidora, his belly, his body, his erect penis, his legs, his feet. I bind his affection, his love to hate her. So this is a jealous lover, probably. The previous one seems like it could be a wider range. This one it could be a rival for Diodorus's affection. Christopher Roney wrote a book called Ancient Love Magic, which goes through a lot of these spells and talks about the aggressive nature of a lot of these spells and how specific they are, as well as who might be practicing. So it could be a woman or a man who's commissioned this. And it could be a courtesan, like somebody who's a prostitute who, wants to keep her patron and doesn't want her patron to move on to another person. And so I've given you these two examples from Greece, but there are a lot of them. We have a couple that are actually female-female and male-male. And so one of the lesbian ones I have on the case studies handout. And we only know that it's female-female because of the names. So it's kind of interesting. It just shows the breadth of these and the formulas and things. It just shows how widely used these were and how these were actually considered a viable strategy for dealing with this very common problem of being in love with somebody and them perhaps not returning your affection, or trying to control the emotions of another person. Right? Okay, next slide, please. And, so those two tablets I showed, those were more aggressive, right? But there's also milder forms of magic, decorating your body in different ways so that you are attractive, right? And they thought this attraction, what is attraction? You know, it's the god piercing you with his arrow, right? The god arrow. So how do you foster such attraction? Maybe you show suggestive images. You appeal to Aphrodite. Uh, you have images of her and her son on jewelry, like you wear jewelry. You make yourself look beautiful. You wear makeup, right? And so even that was considered a form of magic because you are trying to compel uh, somebody or something to do something that they might not otherwise have done. Next slide, please. And then there's more erotic magic. And a lot of these things were found on everyday and private objects. So the one on the far right, of those two lovers, this is on a mirror. So somebody had this in their, you know, on their vanity, in their boudoir, you know, and maybe it's to, you know, incite the affection of their lover. So it's, and you can't just say that these were, you know, the possessions of prostitutes. You know, that's, it's much more complex than that. Although scholars, when they initially saw this, they thought that it would only be in this sort of underground realm, but they're just too many of these mirror casings that have Aphrodite or Venus, and you know, few that have these erotic things for it to just be one set of people. And they're expensive objects, a lot of them, like that far left one, that's a gem that has this carving on it. I mean, that is highly worked, right? And then that middle thing, that's the one that sort of gets people's attention. This thing that in we call voodoo dolls, although that's the term voodoo doll, it's referring to an Afro-Caribbean religion. So that's not what it's, that's completely separate. The Afro-Caribbean voodoo doll is separate from this. So what this is in the middle is it's a doll that's meant to replicate the person. And those pins in it are not to kill them. So a lot of these curse tablets, whether they're about love or about, you know, hurting a rival in either sports or business, they're not meant to kill the rival. They're meant to bind them, to prevent them, to affect them in some way. So it wasn't seen as deathly magic, deathly procedures. Although you could be prosecuted if the person died. For example, if you gave them a love draft, a love potion, and maybe you put too much and maybe they died. So you could be prosecuted for that. But like this doll in the middle, you remember we saw in that curse tablet where it said, may the person be affected, you know, in their eyes, and, you know, and here you could just go through the body parts, right? In their eyes, in their ears, et cetera, et cetera. You just go body part by body part. And so a lot of those spells, they could have been told over an object like this, you know, and every time you say, affect this body part, you put a pin in that body part. Okay. Next slide. And another area that is an everyday, you know, one area where you'd need everyday magic versus, you know, you could still go to to temples and regular sanctuaries and things like that, but healing and protection. So this is something that's like very practical magic to vexing problems, both personal and state. And so I have a bunch of different things here. So you see the Orphic Gold tablets give you protection in the afterlife. The Suva Taralia sacrifice, it protects land and state because you literally march those animals around a perimeter and then you sacrifice them. On the bottom right, that's the theater at Epidaurus. And on the left, you see a physician treating somebody. And that physician, many of them were considered priests of Aesculapius, the god of healing. Next slide. And so for problems of state, a lot of the magic, quote unquote magic we see are things related to protection and prosperity. And the problems are, a lot of them big problems like drought and war and things like that. And so you have the oracle you can go to, but you'd have to, you know, send an embassy to that. You could go to a harispex who might use this sheep's liver diagram. So once they did the sacrifice, they took the sheep's liver out, they would look for blemishes, and if they saw any marks, they could use this as their guideline. And not everybody can read this, so that's another thing. The practitioners developed their own set of terminology and tools, and they became more and more elaborate over time, which shows that there was a certain professionalization of these practitioners, these magical practitioners as well. Just like there'd be priests for temples, and they were specialized in, dealing with certain gods, the magical practitioners became known for certain types of things as well. Next slide. And so here's just the healing sanctuary of Asclepius. So it's kind of a crossover between, so this is a religious place, but this is basically a spa in the ancient world. It's a hospital and a spa. So they had treatments that were things like dream reading and things like that. So if you go to, you may be familiar with Epidaurus. So I just want to show you that this would be considered both religion and from a magical perspective as well. Next paragraph, or next slide. And at a place like Epidaurus, but at any of the Asclepia around the ancient world, you would find votive offerings. And again, this is one of these crossover things that's considered part of religion, but a lot of the elements of it are elements that also appear in magic, which is you try to affect the body part. And so you might actually just buy one of these on site because they were mass produced. As you can see, there are a bunch of legs there, right? So that would be the donation you'd make after you were healed or in order to get healed. And on the bottom left, you see a thumb. And then you see there are a lot of feet. On the upper right, you see a foot and eyes. So somebody had some problem with a foot and their eyes. And on the bottom right, that's the female sexual organs. That's a uterus. So a lot of, we find a lot of internal organs, or what people thought the internal organs looked like, because they were not allowed to do dissection, but they had an idea. Okay, next slide. And here's an interesting votive offering that has an inscription. So Fabia Segunda gives this to Asclepius because my ear was healed in a dream. So this is dream magic, oneromancy. And so she probably stayed there overnight, and a priest helped her tease out and heal through dream magic. Okay, next slide. And finally, the final bit I want to go through is divination, which is sometimes, it seems a little bit odd to us until you think about, because it's like what we would call superstition. So it's the practice of seeking knowledge of the future through supernatural means. And so some of that is through entrail reading, through dreams, through birds, sneezes, and other things. Next slide. And so here are some Roman forms of divination, like I showed you earlier. So entrail reading, birds, things like that. And go to the last two slides, and then we'll open it up. Actually, why don't we go through some case studies? We'll do that now. So we can open up any questions you have.
All right. Does anyone have any questions? And I will stop.
It's not a question. It's just a comment about the object. In Iliad 14, we have even a goddess, Hera, who is going to see Aphrodite because she needs her help. And then Aphrodite gives her her girdle with lots of charm so that she can seduce Zeus. So even a goddess needs the help of another goddess to seduce and to get an object that will help her. So was it?
Yeah, so that girdle, right? I think it's often translated as girdle, right? That is a magical object. It builds attraction, just like, as I said, putting on makeup would.
Yes, so did they find any objects looking like girdles or charms? Or...
Definitely lots of love charms, like those objects I showed you with the pictures of Aphrodite and Eros on them. Those are a similar sort of thing. So a woman might put those on to look more attractive, and also that's a signal to her lover that, you know, she's good to go. She's like ready to be charmed or to be charming, right? So she's all dressed up and, you know, ready to go out. And so I think that that's really, yeah, this, you're trying to compel something using a supernatural force, something that's inexplicable, right? And maybe in modern day we call it like pheromones or chemistry or things like that. And the Greeks would say, well, it's eros. So do you want to look at some of these case studies? Like, were there any that were particularly appealing? I put a few at the start, like the healing for the body ones, you know, for wounds, like even in the Odyssey, as early as that, Odysseus was bound up and they stopped the blood with a charm, you know, and I don't know how many times people just go right through that and read that and don't even think about that, but it's like, what? What is that charm?
Do you know what the Greek word is there offhand?
I don't know it offhand. But yeah, we can all look it up after.
I was wondering about these, they seem kind of like visual charms almost, where it's letters in a line, in lines that get progressively shorter or longer. Are these meant to be pronounced? Are these
a lot
just
of them,
visual, you know?
yeah, a lot of them are read out loud. So there's this thing called magikai wokes. So it's magic, it translates magical voices, but it's just long, yes, good image. So it's just long sequences of letters or words or repetitions of a god's name, or sometimes you'll see a god's name inside of it. Sometimes the god's name is backwards, but it's like how we say abracadabra. So imagine this is like abracadabra over and over. And do you notice it keeps getting smaller and smaller, but it's the same basic thing repeated.
Mm-hmm.
So it creates this, like sometimes even there's a chant. So it's like meditative almost when you see it. But good point.
Anyone else? Anne, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was interested in what you said about the public and the private, and also the fact that a lot of the things you talked about have been about women, not so much about sex and sexuality, but the whole thing, the sort of day-to-day problems and so on. And I'm wondering if this magic was more accessible to women when it was in the home, or whether you've seen any difference between the way women used it and the way men used it.
Thank you for your question. It's a really interesting point. And so one of the things that in the magical practice, it almost seems like an equalizer in terms of practice of back to the supernatural. But most of the love spells we have are male users trying to get a woman attracted to them. So a lot of the curse tablets are with male voices, but and I've shown you, I've shown you the few that have women as the agents. But a lot of, like, especially there is a difference too in the actual like material that they found, which as you see, it's really hard to locate because they're on everyday objects. You know, how do you know that a bowl was just a bowl for the kitchen or a bowl used for some form of divination? You know, like reading reading the ripples in water or something. It's just really hard to tell with things like that. In literature, though, it seems like most of the magical users are women, mostly witches. So there seems to be a bit of misogyny there in the literature, because in actual practice, there are as many men using it, it seems, as women.
Right. Yes, I was thinking of Helen and Medea, both of whom are, well, pharmacists in some sense, and I wondered where that had all come from.
Yeah, well, definitely this association with women and herb use and being, in the kitchen and things like that. And so, a lot of the preparers of food or people who had gardens, they were thought to have knowledge, and they did have knowledge of the different uses for things. And so we don't know, like, we know about like the practitioners, the necromancy practitioners, the necromantic people you could go to. They were called goes in 5th century Athens, you could go and hire a professional to talk to your just to a dead person. So that's, you know, Odysseus had to go himself and create the situation to talk to, right? But there were actual places you could go to on pilgrimage too, that were sort of powerful entrances to the underworld. But then also there were these itinerant practitioners in Athens who you could go to talk to one of your dead relatives. So,
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself. I don't think that I can do it.
Now you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I noticed in that passage you mentioned of the Odyssey, where they say a spell with the advantage of the scar. It's related to the name and the identification of Odysseus. So is there a connection between magic and names and
I don't know about that Odyssey in particular, but yes, names are really important, especially names of gods. And a lot of the gods' names in the magical papyri are lesser, what we would say lesser gods that we actually may not even know about except from the papyri. You know, so they're very
because in that scene, the scar is the sign of identification and name of Odysseus. And so I find a link there, and I don't know if I am correct or not, but names are very important.
Names are important, so, and especially in Homer. So if you see something that other people haven't, you know, maybe pursue that, follow that through. I was also thinking, I don't know what that word is, but I know like a lot of, when you see the word for to charm, like Dalgo or something like that, that's often a word that's like, you know, somebody charms somebody, but our modern definition of charm is so, it doesn't have that magical sense to it in the same way. It does a little, but not in the same way. And so, but for Greeks and Romans who could read that, they would understand this extra element.
Thank you.
The word there is epode. So
epode, thank you.
Yeah, some kind of a song, evidently.
Yeah, well, you know, the language, right? The chant, the language. So the repetition, all of that's really important.
Yeah, Janet.
Hi, Suzanne. Welcome. I like the fact that there's an order of body parts. There's a chant and there's music in it. If we are practicing this in a wrong way, what happens? If it goes wrong?
Good question. So, yeah, what if you did your hecatomb and you still lost the battle, right? Then what? So 2 ways you can look at it. One, you did it wrong. You did the ritual wrong. So, you know, there was this real sense that you had to do things in the right order or get the right material, which again led to the professionalization of this, right? So you had to be a specialist. And then there's also, you could blame somebody for ruining it. So you could get a scapegoat. You could assign a scapegoat or blame the practitioner. And so a lot of these practitioners of magic or things that were not official religion, a lot of them were itinerant, a lot of them were foreigners. And so they were marginal people already. And if you read in Roman literature in particular, they talk about the witches and the hags, and they have all sorts of words for females who practice magic. And Horace in particular, just, you know, he really denigrates them and makes them seem like ugly and wicked and all these things. And, you know, they were just marginal women probably who had to make a living for themselves and were in a lower class. And so they lived a tenuous sort of existence.
And you also mentioned cultural mix of cultural influences in the magic. We still have the evil eye, right?
Yes, actually, yeah, we do. And so I have so one thing I do, so I'm teaching a class called Ancient Magic and Religion to undergraduates. And so one thing I give to them, I don't know if you can see.
Yes, yes.
So it's also, and if you go on Amazon, it's called a hamsa. So it's still used. So it's a Mediterranean thing. So we definitely have examples of this from the ancient world as well. It looks a little bit different.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of this is cultural Mediterranean and the practices are deep and they continue. Okay, should we look at some other examples? Or actually, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one. Could you talk about the indispensable invisibility spell? This is a strange one. Take Fado and I.
What page was that on?
It's on page 9 in the papyri, Greek magical papyri examples.
Okay, yeah. So it's take fat or an eye of a night owl. Do you have that? Did you pull that up? And a ball of dung rolled by a beetle, and oil of an unripe olive, and grind them all together until smooth, and smear your whole body with it, and say to Helios, I adjure you by your great name, Borke Foyor Yo Zitzia Areg, and it goes on and on. Lilam I o eo 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 now nox I eo, and you have to say this, right? And moisten it and say in addition, make me invisible, Lord Helios. Ao, oa, eo, in the presence of any man until sunset. Eo, o, frix rizzo, eoe. So it's really cool to read these out and just see what sounds are being produced and the importance of language in them. And Helios, remember Helios is the one who sees everything. If you go back to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Helios is described as all-seeing Helios. He saw the abduction of Persephone. And so I don't know what exactly your question is, but do you notice that a lot of these things are everyday materials that you can get, but you have to do them in certain combination and you have to smear your whole body. So if it doesn't work, maybe you missed a spot, right? And if you read Apuleius's The Golden Ass, which I highly recommend, he is turned into an ass because he smeared himself with a witch's ointment. And then that's only resolved by him going through initiatory rituals, right? So read that, and that's one of the only personal accounts of initiation that we have in literature, is from the end of Apuleius's Golden Ass, and I think it's chapter 10 and 11 of sort of right at the end. It talks about the personal experience of initiation.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Yeah, sorry.
So you've given a couple of examples that have come from Epic. And I wondered whether there was any similarity in language between some of these incantations or spells and any of the language in Epic, because we've got a few scenarios that there's it's not curses exactly, but people insulting each other or blaming each other on a battlefield, or just generally having verbal contests. And there's examples of people being bathed and anointed, and it's got a slightly initiatory feel about it. And I wonder whether there was any similarities in either the language or context that you've noticed.
Well, definitely the context. I mean, I think the practices of anointing, how you could add a different scent to it that creates a different result or a different mix, right? So I think there's definitely, cultural similarities. In terms of the language, some of it, yes, there are associations, but it's just like if you're reading, something, it's a different register of speaking. So like if I say in English, I giveth this to thou to do, it changes the nature of it. And I think a lot of these spells really capitalize on this altering language, creating, a lot of the lines of spells are poetic, they're in meter. And so, especially like, the Orphic Gold tablet that we have, that's a lot. There are a lot of them in hexameters, so like there's some power in the poetics as well, and in the rhythms and the chants and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I want to point out too on the case study on page 3, the palindrome Greek amulet, which is pretty awesome. So it's Lawe is the bearer of the secret name, the Lion of Re, secure in his shrine, right? But it's written out as a palindrome, and palindromes are powerful magic, right? And this is a powerful protective amulet. And then it also, that's on one side. So you have letters, which maybe not everybody can read, but they still have power nonetheless. And then on the other side, you have gods and images. And so you wear this around your neck and you're good to go. It's like, the baseball player who always wears his lucky mitt or something, right? To go into a game. So people infuse meaning into these objects that are everyday objects. And, let's see what else we have. So the last thing I guess I want to talk about, because I had you read all those afterlife things. So a lot of those readings I had you look at were encounters or imagined encounters with supernatural powers in the afterlife, and just how important those were, like feelings of revelation, feelings of control, like you can control, like a lot of the Orphic Gold tablets. Actually, if you go to the last page of the case studies, you can see the picture of the Orphic Gold tablet on page 5. And you see, so that, it makes it look really big, but you can see from the right, that's a necklace. And so the tablet would have been rolled and put in that holder. And it was found on the body of a dead woman. And it's just really interesting to see, like, people try to control and they had strategies for their afterlife as well as their life. So if in life you have a sickness and you might go to an Escalapion, you might, give that votive offering of the ears, right? With an inscription to say, thank you, I had an earache, now I'm better. But if you have problems and are worried about what happens after you die, and you're wealthy, this is what you might do. You might get initiated into this cult and try to control what happens after you die. So a lot of it is creating this relationship and agency and control in this life and beyond. So a lot of these magical strategies are about that, solving problems and uncertainties. And we do the same. So if we go to the last couple slides of my slideshow, I want to just show you some examples. So next slide, please. So some examples of modern religion, right? So we have churches, we have rosaries, we have statues, like statues of the Buddha. On the right, the bottom right, that says Shinto, little inscriptions to ancestors. On the bottom left, that's Mecca. On the top right, something I saw in LA, these Mexican saint candles. A lot of people practice them. They're Catholics, but it's different from what people in, say, Rome would do, or in other parts of the world who are Catholic. And on the next slide, the last slide I have in this last minute here, some modern examples of magic and what we do. So we have, psychics, right? You've seen some tarot card readers. Some people do palm readings. A lot of people look at their horoscopes. Right. And so that was a very ancient practice as well. Like, does everybody know their sign? I would say most people do, in both Western and maybe even the Chinese zodiacs, right? And then the top right, I put a doctor's office, which, we consider science. But if you look at the tools of implementation, right, and the professionalization, you walk in there and you feel like you're in a professional's office and somebody who has specialized knowledge. And I feel like these magical practitioners probably had a similar setup, right? They have these spell books. If you read Betts's Greek Magical Papyri, you'll see a lot of them are not fully, the spells aren't fully described. It'll just say, it's an expert speaking to other experts. So do a disappearing spell and then take, the following 5 things, mix them together and do what it tells you to do, right? So These were experts and specialists, and they were an important part of the everyday landscape of ancient peoples and their beliefs. Any other questions?
Well, if I may, this is such a broad field, and as you say, it goes back. I mean, to the earliest literature, and I admit that reading about an eunx, a wry neck.
Yeah, the young spells.
in Pindar Pythians 4, where Medea, is charmed to fall in love with Jason.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's like out of another world, but it's if you know more of what you've been presenting from today, you see how it fits into the culture as not being something off the wall, but being really, she falls in love, because this particular either I don't know whether the eunx is a metaphor or I mean
nobody really knows exactly. They know that they have it's a rattle, right? It's a rattle.
Yeah.
But the Yunx is also a bird, and so maybe you look at Theocritus's Idle 2, Samitha uses it as well. And actual birds, you can use actual birds on it, so that's more powerful. I mean, I would think of like a lot of the magical stuff I look at it's almost like triage. Like, what sort of injury do you have? Do you need a Band-Aid? Or do you have a gushing wound? Like, and so so you can step it up. So maybe Young's spell is a lot more powerful than maybe one of these lead tablets, right? Maybe a gold tablet with the same words would be more powerful than a lead tablet, So it's like, how much are you willing to invest in the triage of whatever your problem is?
Well, in Theocritus too, that's just incredible. There was talking there about burnt myrrh, and I see myrrh occurring in these charms over and over. And somewhere else I learned about frankincense and myrrh being, very special fragrances, in pre-Homeric. I mean, the Old Testament.
Yeah, well, they're also, I point to type back to what I was saying, from the East, limited quantities associated with certain peoples, right? Who have maybe a different set of gods. So you're rallying the powers of those different things that are a little bit different, a little bit other, and pulling them in and making them part of your, part of your solution to whatever's going on in your life.
Yes, and it just goes back so much earlier that it seems that the survey books seem to recognize.
Surveys of Greek society, or what surveys?
The histories of Greek literature. It's the magic and the syncretism. It seems as if they want to pick it up at Hellenistic times when it really goes back much earlier.
Yeah, I guess it really depends, because even for people who go back to Homer, like I do, most of my work is in Homer. But yes, I think what sounds like you're saying is like beyond the canon, the major works. There's a lot even in those, but then if you take a wider view, I mean, I think that's one of the things I love as a scholar, is that you can just keep diving deeper and deeper. And, maybe you missed that part where a charm was used over Odysseus's wound when you read it the first 10 times. But if you know to look for it, a lot of these things are marked. They have meaning, and they have meaning, but now you have some comprenda to say, okay, what does that mean? What, like, what is this person taking into battle? Their lucky shield. What does that mean? Who infused it with luck? What? And in English, it might say luck, right? For many different words that are being used that have a different resonance for ancient Greeks, because they did live in this world where, I mean, we do too, in this complex world where we might check our horoscope in the morning. We might do a guided meditation with a chant, right? I mean, they lived in a very complex world as well.
Right, so there's a couple of examples that just suddenly sprung to mind as you were talking, like isn't there some special knot that Circe has shown Odysseus? Would that be like a binding thing, like you were talking about?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be. And being able to, being the one who binds such a thing, and then also being the person who unravels it, right? It can be a one-to-one, depending on the spells put on it. Yeah, and whether or not you use a wand, like we see a few wands as well, like Hermes has a wand, Circe has a wand. And just like you probably have had a discussion about scepters in the Iliad and kingship, and wands are a different type of scepter.
Well, Suzanne, thanks so much. I think our time is about up.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining this conversation. So yeah, please, come to me with questions.
Great, we will. So thanks again, Suzanne. Thanks to all of you out there for joining us. Until next time.
Bye.